everybody filtering in here. We'll give it just a couple of seconds while everybody joins in. Apologize for getting started just a little after the top of the hour. All right, let's fill it up nicely. While we fill up, just want to give a quick reminder that we've got the sales engineering report. The 2021 sales and engineering report is now available. And want to encourage everybody to go and check that out. You can check that out at goconsensus.com/resources. All right, looks like everybody's coming in just nicely. Give it just a couple more seconds. And all right, want to welcome everybody out to today's Scaling Pre-Sales series webinar. We're really excited to have Carrie Sikowski with us today. Carrie is the president of Pre-Sales Mastery, and today he's going to be talking to us about how to pay pre-sales and some of the different strategies and best practices for that. Carrie, thanks for being with us. Really appreciate you jumping on.
Thanks for having me, John. Excited to be here.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Want to welcome everybody out, as I said, and this is, as I mentioned, the Scaling Pre-Sales webinar series. This is a series all about doing more with less when it comes to pre-sales, which is something that we all kind of struggle with over time, especially as pre-sales grows in influence and scope and kind of starts to reach out, whether that's into more into the BDR space, or we're reaching out into the post-sales space. Much more demand on pre-sales resources as time goes on. So it's definitely a growing trend that we're watching. The Scaling Pre-Sales webinar series is presented by Consensus. We are intelligent demo automation software. A little bit about us. Using Consensus, your pre-sales team builds a library of reusable demos that sales then sends out on demand. And by using those kind of chameleon assets, we've reduced unqualified demos for all but eliminated unqualified demos for clients, and we've even doubled pre-sales capacity by doing that. So feel free to jump on over and check us out. And with that, just a quick couple of quick housekeeping items. If you can see my screen, which should show the webinar slide here with Carrie's face on it, go ahead and raise your hand. All right, fantastic. Thanks for that. I'm going to lower all hands. And if you can hear my voice and see my video just fine, raise your hands in case you can't. All right, great. Everything's good there. I'm going to go ahead and lower all hands. And with that, Carrie, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Just a quick little bit of housekeeping. So I still can't see any chat. So I'm hoping
we'll see if we can get the chat going in a little bit. We've got the Q&A all set up, but we're working on the chat.
Okay, so the Q&A is set up. I'm not able to see that as well. So maybe at the end you can feed those to me if we can't get that figured out.
Yep, absolutely.
And just as you did, I want to make sure that everyone can hear me okay. If you are, can you show a little hand up? Great. Thank you for Garrett and Chris and Eldrin and all those folks. I can see the participant list, so that's a good sign. All right, so let's jump into this. I'm going to share my screen here. Bear with me 1 second. All right, and let me know again if you can see my screen. Fantastic. Okay, enough with the questions. We're going to jump into this. I'm actually going to turn my video off so you can focus on what I'm presenting to you and not my ugly mug. All right, so let's jump into it. All right, so quick agenda. We just finished housekeeping and welcomes. We're going to start with why comp is critically important and some of the reasons why it's hard to get right. We'll then talk about some compensation basics, some of the typical comp components you can use and how to determine Paymix. We'll talk about the differences between bonuses and commissions and the pros and cons of each. And then we'll discuss quotas to a limited degree as well. Then we'll get into some best practices for comp and discuss some sometimes overlooked factors that you'll want to consider. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have some time for some Q&A as well. All right, let's dig into it. So compensation by definition, at least in an employment context, refers to the act of providing someone with money or other things of economic value in exchange for their labor or efforts. Almost all people are, to some degree, money motivated. If they weren't, then they would be called volunteers, not employees. Generally speaking, the most money motivated individuals as a group are salespeople. And while pre-sales role in the organization varies by company, we are, by definition of the word, a part of sales. So we should all be at least somewhat money motivated. Which brings up the second function of compensation plans, which is that they also drive behavior. Good plans are designed to motivate the desired behaviors in your team. Conversely, plans that aren't well designed can actually cause people to work against organizational or team goals. Consider Amazon's so-called hire to fire practice, where managers are intentionally hiring people they know they're going to fire. It turns out Amazon managers have a target rate for annual turnover. They're expected to lose, through both voluntary exits and termination, a certain number of people every year. And if they don't meet that goal, they're expected to make up for it the following year. The issue is that these goals aren't just measured to track the health of the organization. Managers are actually rewarded for meeting them. So they're hiring people they normally wouldn't, just to later fire them to hit their goal. What's even more insidious than hiring just to fire is that the purpose of the goal is being prevented by this artificial new behavior. Employees who would normally fall at the low end of the performance spectrum and hence be in line to be terminated are now staying because it's the hire to fire folks that are being released instead. Now, Amazon doesn't actually have a written hire to fire policy, but it has become part of their management culture as a way to protect their team from artificial turnover goals and a desire to hit their incentives in the least painful way possible. Clearly a broken plan. Now, I don't need a poll to tell me that the majority of this audience probably believes that pre-sales is just as, if not more important than sales in determining if opportunities are won or lost. And yet, despite the fact that the latest consensus survey that John talked about showed that the majority of you feel that pre-sales' influence in the organization is on par with or better than sales, my guess is most of you would suggest that you're paid less than your sales counterparts on an OTE basis. Plan misalignment can cause internal friction as people have different goals, but it can also cause resentment when there are material differences in the way teammates are paid. If a sales rep and an SE close a $2 million deal and the sales rep gets a 10% commission, but the SE only sees their team revenue target of, say, 50 million increased by 4%, and therefore only sees incremental progress to some far off annual bonus that she may or may not qualify on, the SE may resent the fact that they had as much or more of an impact on the close of that deal, while their AE counterpart is getting rich and probably paid next month, where she's only seeing a tiny fraction of that and not until the distant future. All of this can lead to lower overall morale and contribute to increased turnover. Perhaps even more importantly, driving the right behaviors ultimately impacts the bottom line, both at an individual and organizational level. CSO Insights did a study that showed that organizations where the comp plan consistently drove precise selling behaviors had 7% higher revenue attainment to plan and a massive 33% more salespeople who met or beat quotas. If you are driving the right behaviors, your team and your organization are going to do substantially better. So it's critical that you get your plans right. And despite that, only 60% of pre-sales leaders actually believe their team's plans are effective. So clearly, there's a lot of upside in potential revenue and earnings if those organizations can get it right. So comp is critical, but it's also hard to get right. There is no one-size-fits-all model, but there are a lot of influencing factors to consider, each of which has its own set of complications and implications. What responsibilities does pre-sales hold outside of sales? Are they responsible for marketing support like webinars or manning trade show demo booths? Are they responsible for post-sale activities like client enablement or support? Do they support channel partners? If they have multiple responsibilities, what should their priorities be? And are they being adequately compensated for doing what's being asked of them? Responsibilities that aren't incentivized tend to be marginalized by the team in terms of level of effort or quality of work. How involved is pre-sales in the sales process? Are they just used for discovery or demos? Or are they true partners with their sales counterparts, contributing things like overall deal strategy, building the business case, and even pricing and contracting? If they're true partners, they'll be more likely to resent being compensated differently than sales is. Then there's deal assignment and allocation. This is different for almost every organization, right? It can be by geographic territory, named accounts, product specialties, business segment, or a mix of the above. And there are different implications for deal assignment and allocation depending on how that works. For example, if SEs are assigned to deals based on geography, the larger the territory, the more flexibility pre-sales leadership has in assigning deals to people. The downside is, in larger territories, that typically equates to larger targets or quotas, which makes them harder to attain and outperform. If they're assigned by a specific account or a specific rep, then specific pairings run the risk of a weak rep or a weak SE greatly impacting the other's ability to win business. There's another challenge that people don't think about necessarily when you're assigning at the specific rep level, and that is that it can stunt cross-team enablement. When I was at Verisant running pre-sales, our teams were assigned, at least the SEs, at the continental level. This allows for fantastic cross-team exposure, with both the AEs and the SEs being exposed to a large number of their counterparts, meaning they picked up more on best practices and approaches than they otherwise would, and could then cross-pollinate that learning to other reps that they work with on the next deal, improving everyone across the board. We need to think about as well what types of opportunities is pre-sale supporting. Like channel sales, if they're expected to support renewal sales, they should be compensated in those deals. But the way renewals are rewarded should often be different than the way new business is compensated, given that pre-sales role in those types of sales may be very different. We got to consider company and team culture. If it currently dictates a team-first approach, there can be some cognitive dissonance in trying to promote and use individual comp plans. We'll talk later about some ways to mitigate those concerns. And as mentioned earlier, money motivation plays a big part in how people want to get paid in their behaviors. If you have a team that isn't money motivated, you may have to leverage very different compensation measures than ones who are. And finally, what behaviors are you actually looking to drive? It's imperative that you know what you're rewarding and, more importantly, why. Yes, Amazon wanted turnover at specific levels of the organization, but universally requiring managers to meet those targets didn't make sense, causing artificial means to achieve the goal. Okay, so now we know why we're here. Let's get into some of the basics. We're going to mostly focus on the financial components of compensation for today's discussion, but it is important to recognize that there are lots of intrinsic or non-financial motivators that you can reward employees with that can enhance, or in some cases even replace, the need to offer more money elsewhere. One underutilized component that I do want to call out is retention plans. They're typically only used post-acquisition, but they can be a very effective tool to retain top performers in any situation. Bottom line here, you have a lot of weapons in your arsenal to use to reward and retain your teams. All right, John, do you have access to the chat? Is everyone able to actually see the chat? Because if they are, I'd love to sort of ask the audience a question here.
I think we're still working on the chat. So.
Okay, so there's no chat. I was going to ask everyone before I get into Paymix, what percentage of your on-target earnings is in variable comp? And because we can't do that, we'll move on and actually start to talk about what it is. So Paymix takes into account 3 items: base salary or guaranteed income, that's the stuff in dark blue; target incentive, which is essentially your at-risk pay up to an individual's on-target earnings, that's the stuff in the light blue; and then upside incentive, which is potential earnings over and above on-target earnings at goal. The amount of pay at risk should typically align to the individual's degree of influence over a sale. Market makers like mortgage brokers or financial advisors who have complete and often sole influence over their sales typically have a very low or no base salary, and 100% of their pay is based on incentives. Hunter roles also have relatively low proportion of pay and base versus, say, farmers or pre-sales, which tend to be in the 70-30 type of range. A few concepts here. First, the more at-risk pay I'm willing to take, the more upside I should expect to receive for outperforming. That's the green bars you see here. For every dollar of salary that's reduced from on-target earnings, assume that you should be replacing it with 2 to 3 times that in upside earnings opportunity. Upside here doesn't imply that it's capped, just what it might be at a certain level of excellence. So these green bars don't mean that that's the most that this individual can get. It just means that at some defined level, say 125% of goal, this is where they might be in these different roles. Upside is also highly dependent on incentive type. Commissions typically have a much higher upside than bonuses, and we'll explore that in more detail a little bit later. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the differences between commissions and bonuses. Commissions are paid when each sale is made, whereas bonuses tend to be paid when a certain threshold is met, like a sales quota is reached or a particular number of sales are closed. Therefore, commissions tend to be realized much earlier than bonuses, meaning employees get a higher percentage of their OTE sooner. Commissions tend to be exclusively objective, but some bonuses can be subjective, which can be both a pro and a con, giving managers discretion to reward team members that have gone above and beyond, gives them flexibility to reward behaviors that aren't necessarily easily measured. On the other hand, discretionary rewards can be difficult to justify and can be perceived as managers playing favorites, which in some cases can cause resentment. For commissions, there's flat rates that will pay the same on every dollar, while tiered rates are when the payout rate actually rises as certain attainment levels to quota increase. Finance tends to like tiered commission rates because they actually reduce payout risk for underachievers. Someone that achieves to 25% of their goal may only actually be paid out, for example, 10% of their on-target earnings at that level. There's also this concept of continuous versus stepped. Continuous is where you're paid on the first dollar for all sales, versus stepped, which is effectively like a floor where payments only start once a certain threshold is achieved, say 50% of attainment. They're pretty rare and typically only used when the territory is guaranteed to hit a certain level of sales regardless of who's working it. For bonuses, payout types are pretty simple. They're usually either a percentage of salary, or on-target earnings in this case, or a flat amount. Acceleration refers to higher payouts once an SE hits their target. It's rare for bonuses to offer acceleration, but if they do, it's usually in the form of additional thresholds that need to be met over and above that on-target amount. Most commission plans, on the other hand, offer upside for every sales dollar over 100%. Because of that, earnings under commissions tend to have higher upside than bonuses. Bonuses tend to be more flexible since they can align to more goals or objectives than commissions can. So again, they tend to allow managers to be able to incent different types of behaviors. But another plus for commissions is that they tend to be paid more frequently, usually at a monthly level. Conversely, bonuses tend to be quarterly or annually. As far as payments go, the rule of thumb is the sooner the better. The shorter the time between action and reward, the stronger and more psychologically valuable that reward is. When salespeople are paid upon a deal being booked, it results in instant gratification and positive reinforcement, which encourages repeat effort. All right, a couple of considerations specific to bonuses. Where possible, try to avoid activity-based metrics. Being busy rarely equates to being good or influencing results. Measure activity levels by all means, but don't pay on them. Be careful if you're paying SEs on colleague or customer reviews or NPS scores. There will inherently be biases involved, both positive and negative. And in many cases, people are going to use non-uniform evaluation criteria in their scores. Even well-defined scorecards will be interpreted differently by each person. They're also rife for gaming. For example, an individual may give a glowing review for their friend, regardless of how they actually thought they did, or an AE may give a really crappy score to an SE they want to avoid being paired up with in the future. Win rate can also have problems. Is it higher because they're better or because they're assigned to less complex or easier to win deals? Or maybe because they're paired with the best reps? Technical win is a popular metric, but does it even really matter if the deal never closes? My suggestion is it doesn't, and therefore shouldn't be compensated on. If the business has short-term goals, for example, selling a newly released module in the first 2 months after launch, consider using SPIFs, or Sales Program Incentive Funds. SPIFs are meant to be incremental to other existing incentives, meaning they're not included in someone's variable pay targets. As a general rule, if sales is getting them, pre-sales should as well. Now, the trigger or criteria or payout for SEs may be different, but you want to make sure you're aligned with the sales team in all aspects of comp, and this is no exception to that. For non-revenue generating activities, they may be the basis for some bonuses, but my suggestion is to try to make them part of the standard set of responsibilities for the role. SEs tend to have fairly generous salaries, so set the expectation that the job includes those other tasks. To help with that, make sure you include those tasks in your formal job description so new hires come into the role understanding what's expected of them. If you do take this approach, then definitely make sure to reward those that go above and beyond by using those activities as criteria when determining your merit pay increases. Couple of considerations for commissions. Accelerators are incredibly effective at driving overachievement, but a couple of things to think about when restructuring them. Multiple tiers tend to be very effective in continuously giving sellers an aspirational number to shoot for. For example, they may get a 1.5 times multiplier or accelerator from 100% to 125% attainment to quota, and a 2.5 times accelerator rate from 125% to 150%. Having additional targets to aim for can psychologically drive behavior. For managers or individuals on team quotas, recognize that because those targets are larger, they're less likely to be achieved. So use lower hurdle rates and or higher multipliers. Hurdle rates are the attainment percentages at which accelerator rates kick in. So if an individual accelerator rate kicks in at 100% and 125% attainment, a team quota accelerator might kick in at 100% and 110%. Where possible, try to avoid restrictions on accelerators without good reason. I worked at a company where accelerators were only paid on license, but pre-accelerator credit was given for license, services, education, maintenance, and hosting. That restriction drove behavior as sellers ignored or de-emphasized the uncredited sales components to win more business as they hit their accelerators. Finally, some companies take an odd stance and use decelerators to actually lower payout rates over certain thresholds. I've yet to hear a good reason why decelerators should ever be used. Similar to ceilings or caps, where earnings are cut off at a certain level, essentially the most extreme form of a decelerator, these are rare, but they should be avoided in almost all cases. They send the wrong message, and that is that we only want you to do great up to a certain level, and then we don't really value your effort over and above that. It's one of the easiest ways to turn off top performers. All right, so I've done a lot of speaking here. Unfortunately, because I don't have chat, haven't been able to be interactive, so I'm not necessarily delivering a great demo. Thankfully, this is a webinar, but we are going to do something a little interactive here. So we're going to switch over to a audience poll here. So what I'd like you to do is go on your phones. Don't do it on your computer because you'll be able to see the results live here. But take your phone out and open up a browser on your phone and go to menti.com and type in the code that you can see at the top of the screen here, 5681-1113. Once you get there, I want to know what you think the number 25.4% represents. Is it the average percentage of SEs that make 100% or more of their on-target earnings? Is it the percentage of SEs using the job title solution consultant? Is it the average variable portion of SEs Paymix? Is it
just a quick interruption. I think we're still seeing your slide here. So if you're referencing the Menti screen, you may need to
let's fix that. Can you see it now?
There we go.
Okay.
Now we can see the Menti code and all of that stuff. Yeah.
Very sorry for that. All right, so you should be able to see the different options in there, and as the results come in here, you'll now start to see what we have here. So we're going to give you about 30 seconds or so to enter that in. We're not tracking who got it right or wrong here, so don't be shy.
Just don't get it wrong.
All right, so we're getting some different answers, which is kind of nice. Give it another 15 seconds here. Looks like a good chunk, half of you think that it's the average variable portion of SE Paymix. Ah, it's solution contained job title. I like that. Okay, so as these numbers come in, we'll sort of keep this up on the screen. The correct answer here, and frankly, all of the above technically could be the right answer, but the correct answer is the yellow slice. It is the percentage of SEs that hold an individual quota, which is, to me, as someone who spent a long time in the comm management space, a mind-boggling stat. So if you're wondering how that number came about, in the consensus survey that John was referencing, they measured for the US, the UK, and the EU markets, the percentage of individual contributors or practitioners that held an individual quota. In the US, it was about 27.6%. In the EU, I think it was about 24%. And in the UK, unbelievably, it was, I think, less than 16%. On a weighted average, it was about just over 25%. So what this means is only 1 in 4 individual practitioner SEs is ultimately responsible solely for their comp. Everybody else is in some way, shape, or form dependent upon their team's results or something else. And I'll explain to you as we go through the next couple of slides why I'm very surprised by this result. All right, let's switch back.
I think we just lost your audio, Carrie. I think you just went to mute.
I did.
There we go.
Thank you for that.
You bet.
Oh, okay, perfect. Can you guys see my PowerPoint slide now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, fantastic. All right. So let's explore some of the implications of team versus individual quotas. One of the biggest reasons managers tend to advocate for team plans is that they implicitly promote teamwork and collaboration, while individual plans by their nature do not. They're going to require managers to use other avenues to build in that culture. When it comes to new hires who likely won't be productive early on, team plans can help subsidize their ramp time, where individual plans would typically be required to look at other alternatives like guarantees or draws in order to make that individual whole. The challenge with team plans subsidizing new hires is that it's essentially taking money out of the pocket of established SEs. For deal assignments, team plans tend to give managers more flexibility in assigning SEs, since there's no need to balance the aggregate opportunity across individuals. If one team member gets a ton of great opportunities and another doesn't, it doesn't matter because they're sharing in the same team quota. On the other side, individual plans do require managers be much more careful about allocating deals out equitably across the team to ensure that everyone has an equal shot at hitting their quota. That can be challenging in some cases. One knock against team plans is that they reward weaker or lower effort players, which can cause resentment from top performers, or even potentially incent them to regress to the mean, since doing so may not have a material impact on their earnings. Individual plans, on the other hand, can actually accelerate thinning of the herd, so to speak, through increased voluntary attrition of poor performers, since because they're now earning a lot less, they self-select themselves out of the role much quicker. Finally, while team plans have lower volatility and variability on earnings, they also have substantially lower upside. Individual plans are the opposite. They have higher risk, but also much higher reward. If we think back to that last number I just showed of 25.4%, the reason I was so surprised is because people on individual plans will likely make much more money than those on team plans. And if we are money motivated, because we're in sales, that should be where we want to be. To prove this out, let me share some math with you. Now, normally I would never advise showing an Excel type page in a webinar or a demo, but bear with me here as I quickly walk through this. Oh, click the wrong thing. Let's assume we have a fictitious team of 10 SEs, okay, players A through J. They all have the same salary and variable on target. This is about a 71-29 mix, so in line with typical sort of 70-30 splits. And normally this may be very different for each team members, but for the purpose of simplicity, they're all the same. Under a team plan, the total quota is $20 million, right? Which means that their payout rate for everything up to quota is going to be 0.2%. 0.2% times 20 million gets to that $40,000 variable target. Let's assume they have a 2.5 times multiplier or accelerator rate, which means that their payout over 100% is going to be 0.5%. The individual equivalent plan is that each individual is holding 1/10, because there's 10 players, of that quota. Again, this can vary, but let's assume it's the same for everybody. So they're each holding $2 million in quota, which means their payout rate up to on target is going to be 2%. Again, 2% times 2 million, 40,000. And their accelerator is the same as a 2.5 times multiplier, giving them a 5% payout on over 100%. So what I've done here is I've modeled out potential revenue and attainment percentages for each of these team members, half of which I've said have exceeded their targets and half of which have not hit their targets. If we look at the team plan, in aggregate, the team did 99% of quota. They had just under 20 million. What that means is everybody in the team effectively is getting 99% of their variable target, or almost $40,000. Decent turnout? Sure. Under the individual plan, however, you can see that those folks that overachieved on their plan made substantially higher payouts than they would have under the team plan, even though it's the same total aggregate sales. In fact, this individual over here, the first one at 180% attainment, made 3 times their variable target, or 120K. Under the team plan, they would have made the same amount of money as someone who contributed 25% of the same performance. Fair? Who knows? What's really interesting, though, about this is not only can individuals significantly accelerate their pay, but the entire team in aggregate actually sees a substantially higher payout under an individual plan versus the team plan. In this case, it's more than 25% higher at the aggregate level. And that's because it's a lot easier for individuals with lower quotas to get into accelerators than it is for teams with very high numbers. The problem with it making it difficult with large numbers to hit your quota is that they can be much less aspirational for the individuals under those types of plans. So this is part of the reason why, in my opinion, individual incentive plans, if your team is money motivated, are absolutely the route to go. What's interesting is that augmenting this argument about higher earning potential is some interesting data from the consensus survey as well, that actually showed that SE practitioners that carried personal or individual quotas held salaries that were 10% higher and variable pay targets that were 19% higher. So both expected and potential pay are higher with individual quotas. All right. So this next slide covers a whole bunch of common objections to implementing individual quota commission plans, right? It's important to note, though, that there are multiple ways to address every one of these through creative approaches and effective management. I'm not going to talk to all of them, but for example, the objection that territories don't have equitable earning opportunities can be dealt with either by varying commission rates or quotas by territory. Just as not everyone has the same salary or OTE, they also don't need to have the same quotas or payout rates. If the chat is working, I don't know if it is, and you can see this, if you have any other sort of objections that you've seen or considered about why you don't want to move to individual plans, feel free to put them in the chat and we can address them in the Q&A at the end. All right, so let's talk about quotas here. So the first thing is to discuss is the period of the quotas being measured on, whether it's annual, semi-annual, or quarterly. There are rare cases where it's monthly, but I advise against that, and I'll explain why here. Shorter periods of measurement for quota increase variability in terms of achievement and accelerators and can therefore cause unexpected results. Consider this quarterly plan. Again, apologies, we're going to put some math up here. This will be the last time I do this, I promise. So let's take that one of the individuals from that team we just talked about earlier. Same plan, same payout rates, same annual quota, but under a quarterly plan, they would have, in this case, an evenly distributed quarterly quota. Now, in a lot of cases, most companies do an outsized amount of their business, let's say in Q4 or a different quarter. In that case, quotas may actually be weighted accordingly, but let's say for simplicity's sake that the quarterly quota is the same in all quarters. Similar to the last slide, I made some assumptions here about what revenue and therefore attainment would be in each quarter for this individual. I put 2 quarters where they overachieved their targets and 2 quarters where they underachieved their targets. Now, if we take their annual variable target of 40K and we also spread that evenly across the quarters, 10K per quarter, you can see that in the quarters where they overachieved, they hit accelerators and did fairly well, and the quarters where they didn't do so well. What's important to note is, despite the fact that in aggregate for the year, this individual only hit 94% of attainment, you would think that their variable target would be less than 40K, or payout would be less than their target. Instead, they actually got paid over 25% more than their variable target. That's a bit of an anomaly that you can decide whether you think is reasonable or not. Under an annual plan, at 94% attainment, they would get paid out 94% of their variable target, or 37.5K. Big difference between the two, right? So something to definitely consider when you're determining how long a period is you're going to measure quota in. Where possible, try to avoid inconsistencies with your sales cycle durations. If you have a 6-month sales cycle, a quarterly plan period probably isn't going to make sense. Also, something to consider that most people don't is that your plan period length can also affect turnover in a small way. If we think about when people leave organizations to go to another firm, they typically won't leave until any sort of pending commissions or bonus payouts are paid. If they're under an annual plan, that typically will require them to stay longer to the end of the year before, let's say, an accelerator is paid out on or a bonus is paid out on. But if they're under a quarterly plan, you're going to have them leaving much more frequently and much earlier. So that hopefully your turnover is not crazy and people aren't leaving because of that very quickly or very often, but it is something to think about. Next, we need to think about what metrics we're actually measuring on, whether it's annual recurring or monthly recurring revenue. Is it annual contract value or total contract value? Are you paying out on licenses and or services? Where appropriate, consider separate quotas by product or revenue type. It's very rare to see a commingled license and services quota since they're very different beasts. They have considerably different margins. So, aggregating them together based on revenue likely wouldn't work unless you're applying a multiplier to account for profitability for services revenue. The easier way to do that is to have separate quotas for license and for services. What you shouldn't do, assuming that services sales are important and pre-sales has an influence on that, is just decide that because services are lower margin, they shouldn't be compensated on at all. Change your comp plan metrics to suit the actual measure. The next thing that's really important here is to make sure that you're aligning what you're paying on to what you're and what you're calculating quota on to what you're crediting your SEs for. You shouldn't ask someone to hold quota for a 3-year deal if you're only paying out on the first year of that deal. There are lots of reasons why organizations would look to limit risk on longer term deals, right? There's chargebacks, there's cancellations, there's non-payment, but there is a benefit to contractually locking in longer term deals, and that should be rewarded. I worked in an organization where 1-year deals were paid out at 1 times ACV, 2-year deals were paid out at 1.5 times ACV, and 3-year deals were paid out at 2 times ACV. The problem was they assigned quota for the entire duration of that contract. So on a 3-year deal, I was holding quota for the full 3-year deal, but only getting credit for 2 years of that. It caused a massive rift with me and my CFO because the CFO didn't understand this concept, having only worked in perpetual license models before and having never created or administered a SaaS subscription plan. So make sure that what you're crediting for is also what you're holding quota for. Underassign is the idea that managers responsible for a group of reps may be given a total quota that is less than the sum of their reps' quota. And this typically is to account for new rep hire time, turnover, and other factors. If quotas are assigned at a team level, similar underassigns should typically take place for the team. Also, when determining what an underassign is, it's a lot easier to make sure you're incorporating things like ramp time, time to get, the sales cycle time for new hires, because if they ramp in 3 months and that's when they start getting into the field and your average cycle time is 6 months, they're probably not going to start hitting their numbers until 9 months out. You need to build that into your quota planning at the start. It's a lot easier to do that at the start than it is to adjust to that later on. So make sure you're taking those things into account when you're working on negotiating your quotas at the beginning of the year. And finally, it's imperative that you be transparent with your team about how quotas are calculated. The less pushback you'll receive, the more transparent you are about how it works. Well, quotas were typically going to go up every year, often without explanation of what's changed, right, in terms of deal support or ability to win sales. Reps are often going to challenge that rationale. If you're explaining to them how it's determined, though, you'll help build and maintain their trust. All right, so let's talk about some best practices. So the first thing is making sure we're incenting the right metrics. The best metrics pay on 4 key criteria. First, they're aligned to corporate and team goals to ensure that behaviors are consistent. Second, they reward behavior or performance that the SE has influence over. They don't need to control the outcome, but they do have to have influence over it. For example, you would not influence, an SE very likely doesn't have influence over pricing. If they don't, you wouldn't include metrics based on margin. If you have multiple metrics, they should be prioritized by plan weight, the percentage of the total variable pay that each represents, so that the SE knows which ones are most important. Additionally, each should be meaningful on its own. None should be worth less than 10%, because if they are, that's not really meaningful enough to impact behavior. And finally, they should be reliable. The best metrics are objective, fully transparent in terms of the value or measurement, and can be measured in a timely fashion. One additional piece of advice here: don't reward behaviors that will still take place without being explicitly compensated. I worked with an organization that split quota between on-premise and cloud sales, and they provided a much higher accelerator for cloud overachievement because they wanted to promote recurring cloud revenue. The issue was sales was already exclusively selling cloud anyway, because that's the only thing customers wanted. So effectively, they were paying them more when they didn't need to. It is very important that your targets are realistic and achievable. And achievable does not mean easy. It means that the rep's perceived or real view is that it's attainable. And the best way to accomplish that is to be transparent in how quotas were determined, as I discussed a second ago. If SEs feel that their quota is unattainable, they will look for other opportunities. All right. Before we get into the next slide, we're going to do one more little poll here in Menti. So I'm going to switch over and go back on your phone to menti.com, use that same code, and type in how many plan components your plan has. How many different components are you paid on? Give everyone about 30 seconds to do that. Okay, 2 and 3 seem to be most popular. Couple with 1, 4 with 4, and impressively, no one with 5 or more, which is a great thing. All right, excellent. So let's switch back here and we'll talk a little bit about the idea that you really need to avoid complexity in terms of how SEs understand their plans and how they're administered. Participants need to fully understand their plan, the behaviors needed to maximize their earnings, and their performance to the plan throughout the year. If the plan isn't clear, your SEs will prioritize what they feel they should focus on, which may not align to the plan's actual intentions. Now, this next one is really important, and that is that the data proves it out. Performance is substantially higher when reps fully understand their plans versus when they don't. That same CSO Insights survey showed that reps that truly understand from their plan how to maximize their earnings massively outperform ones that don't. And in an aggregate, the company does much better in terms of overall revenue attainment. So making sure your plans are simple and understandable is absolutely critical, both at an individual and corporate level. Ideally, you want 3 or fewer measures. If you start to get higher than that, right, it makes it harder for the reps to know what activities to focus on. And definitely under no circumstances have more than 5 measures. I'm very pleased to see that no one in that response actually had that. All right, next best practice is to get finance on board, right? There was a recent study that showed that 69% of pre-sales leaders do not fully own their own compensation plans. That means that you're going to have to get finance and or sales leadership on board to get what you want. The first thing you want to do is to make sure you have a unified front by getting sales leadership on the same page. If you can't convince them, you're going to have a very hard time convincing finance. Recognize too that sales and finance are typically misaligned. Sales wants to increase revenue, finance wants to improve margins. Sales wants more analytics and information, finance wants to reduce IT costs. Ultimately, both should agree that lots of sellers making lots of money is a good thing. And it's easier to convince finance when you're talking about variable comp that's tied to sales or revenue that is effectively funding that compensation. If you're supporting other departments like customer success or channels or marketing, suggest that budget from those departments contribute to funding pre-sales plans. It doesn't always work, but it can't hurt to ask. And finally, if finance is treating your pre-sales team differently than sales, put the onus back on them to justify that's the case when pre-sales, as most of us on this call know, is just as, if not more integral to winning deals than the sales team. So this next one is a bit of a shout out to my former colleagues at Verisant and the other solutions in their space. And that is that we should, most organizations hopefully have this, but if they're not, they should be using a sales performance management or incentive comp management to measure compensation and track compensation. Because the inability to track or measure comp and the right compensation metrics should never be the reason not to implement the right plan, right? Some plan mechanics are impossible to track in Excel, right? But these types of solutions easily automate almost any type of plan that you can think of. Aside from ensuring that you can create and implement the right plans, they have a slew of other benefits, right? They can ensure payment accuracy, avoiding things like underpayments and overpayments that can be a nightmare to otherwise find and correct. They offer full transparency, we talked about that earlier, into how payment values were determined. That's usually through detailed reporting on plan metrics and performance. There are very few things more demoralizing to a seller than closing a deal that you think is going to result in a huge payout and then seeing a number on your paycheck that doesn't match up. Unexpected results like that can cause organizational trust issues. These types of solutions also allow managers to model out new plans. And what this allows you to do, if you're making a material change to your plan from one year to the next, is actually model out past performance against the new plan and then determine who's going to be significantly impacted so you can warn them ahead of time to say, look, you've been focusing, for example, on perpetual license model deals last year. If you do that under the new plan where we're focused on subscription models, you're going to see a 70% drop in your comp. You'd rather give them a warning ahead of time to do the right things rather than have them have a rude awakening on their first paycheck. Like modeling out new plans, the ability to forecast future earnings can be massively aspirational and can motivate behavior. If an SE knows that they're only 10K away from an accelerator, they may behave differently than if they didn't know that. And there's other benefits as well. So our job as sales leaders is to build great teams and help them succeed. But voluntary or involuntary turnover is a major disruption to any sales organization. When an SE leaves, it impacts existing customer relationships, territory coverage, and remaining sales team members. Long new ramp hire times, which can stretch from 3 months to a year or longer, mean that even a single SE leaving the organization can impact a team's ability to make plan. And that doesn't take into account the cost of recruiting, hiring, and training new SEs. The good news is that retaining your top performers and keeping them happy usually costs a fraction of those replacement and business impact costs. So be proactive. Offer merit increases in salary and variable pay without waiting for your SEs to ask you for a raise. It sounds counterintuitive, but I always encourage my teams to take recruiter calls for two reasons. First, I made it clear that we highly valued them, and if they found a better offer in the open market, we wanted the opportunity to match it. That honesty meant that I was almost never blindsided by someone leaving the company for more money. Second, and unrelated to comp, it was usually a great way to acquire competitive intel by having our SEs get demos from our competitors. I mentioned retention plans earlier, but they're extremely effective as golden handcuffs to keep people on board for long durations. I've seen retention plans with payments that stretch as far as 4 years out. The amounts need to be meaningful, but don't discount them as effective tools. And don't wait until someone has a competing offer in hand and isn't ready to leave before offering them. Evaluate your SEs, which SEs on your team would significantly impact your results if they left, and proactively offer these types of plans to them. Ultimately, if you can retain your top performers, your job is going to be significantly easier in the long run. One of the best things I did when I was running pre-sales teams, at least in my opinion, was always ask the team every year if they wanted any changes in their comp plan before we created and rolled out new plans. Even if there's no realistic chance of that input affecting or impacting the plan, at least solicit their preferences, as it'll let them know that their voices are being heard and that you care. And more importantly, you'll also learn what their motivations and or their outlook for the year are, which can be important to understand what their mindset is. All right, a couple of quick overlooked factors, and then we'll get into some Q&A. First, if there's a way to game your plan, reps will change their behavior to do it. For example, don't choose short plan periods that promote sandbagging or other time-based gymnastics. As an example, consider a rep on a quarterly plan who has a deal worth 50% of her quota late in the negotiation stage. It's the end of the quarter and the rep is currently at 20% attainment. She can try to close the deal this quarter and end up around 70% attainment for the quarter, or she could push the deal to the start of the next quarter where now she's starting a quarter at 50% attainment and has the full quarter to now work into her accelerators. As shown before, longer plan periods have less variability and therefore less games to be shown. It's very important that pre-sales and sales are a unified team. We talked at the start about non-financial mechanisms, and recognition was one of them. One of the easiest ways to make SEs feel appreciated is to celebrate them on an equal footing with their AE peers. When you release win announcements, for example, attribute the SE just as prominently as the AE, not as someone who simply helped the AE close the deal. When you're presenting a win-loss report at a team meeting or an SKO, right? It should be a joint presentation between both the AE and SE as joint winners of that deal. For sales rewards like President's Club, SEs should absolutely have equal opportunities to attend. Where possible, set criteria for inclusion that's consistent with the sales team. So if sales has 110% attainment to quota as a criteria, use the same criteria for your SEs. If you have SEs on team plans, where possible, try and track their individual closed revenue to qualify off of that instead. Now, there are lots of reasons why multiple SEs might be involved in a single deal. And how to handle those situations from a comp perspective can seem tricky, but I have a bunch of suggestions here. And an ICM SPM solution will absolutely help with these as well. First, define the minimum level of participation in an opportunity below which any contribution isn't worthy of participating in a payout. For example, if an SE performed a generic demo 6 months ago, and then the opportunity was resurrected and assigned to a new SE who had to start from scratch, that first SE's demo likely had no material impact on the close. They shouldn't be included in a split. Split percentages ideally should be predicated on the level of effort contributed to the deal and the impact that effort had on winning the deal. If you can provide a guideline of how typical different SE activities in the sales cycle would be weighted, that can help as a basis for starting negotiations. And ideally, it's the individuals involved in the split that are the ones that should be encouraged to determine how the split will work out between themselves. If they can't come to an agreement, provide them with your own perspective and then give them another shot to work it out. If they still can't come to a resolution, give them a chance to make their case and then decide for them. Where possible, try to avoid situations where more than 2 people are splitting a deal. 3 egos is considerably more difficult to manage than 2. And finally, try and encourage the team to have a longer term perspective. At some point, the tables are going to be turned, and the primary SE is going to want their colleagues' help on something else, or the secondary SE is going to want their primary colleagues' help. If they're contentious and greedy in their approach to determining their split percentages, their colleagues are going to be less likely to want to work with them. All right, so what are our takeaways? Where possible, leverage individual quotas and commission plans where appropriate to drive over performance and maximize earnings. Be consistent with your sales team to align motivations, improve optics, and reduce friction. Avoid universal one-size-fits-all plans. Customize your plans to your geos, your teams, your individuals, or situations to ensure that you're incenting the right behaviors for everyone. Keep it simple and be transparent. Easily understood plans result in higher individual and team performance. Use an SPM or an ICM solution to provide clarity on plans, performance, and earnings, and to ensure payment accuracy and trust, and proactively pay to retain your best team members. And with that, I will wrap up and open it up for questions, and hopefully we've gotten the chat working. John, has that been rectified or not?
You know what? Just a quick apology to everybody on the chat side. This is our first webinar since DemoFest, and we had to do some fairly significant modifications to Zoom in order to get it to integrate with our DemoFest platform that we use. So that's all just getting worked out on this session. So apologize for lack of chat on this. I would like to try something different. We only have just a minute or two for a Q&A, but what I'd like to try here, and this is the first time we've done it, so so apologies if it all just goes completely pear-shaped. But if you'd like to ask a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and I will actually enable you to talk directly on the webinar, and we'll see if we can do a quick Q&A that way.
Awesome.
So if you have a question, just go ahead and hit the hand raise, and I'll allow you to ask it live. In the meantime, I had one question that came up for me as I was looking at your last recommendations there, and that is you talked about letting participants kind of argue the split between them. That seems like it has, just on the face of it, seemed like it had the potential to kind of drive a rift into teams as opposed to having just clearly set out splits beforehand. Can you speak to that a little bit and how to avoid that?
Yeah, it's a great point. So I think, hopefully you're fostering a team and collaborative culture on your teams regardless of what you're doing around comp. And people realize that it's a you scratch my back, I'm going to scratch your back type of situation. It is absolutely true if people are sort of, contentious around being greedy about arguing for a split, for an extra couple of percent, and it's going to piss off a colleague, right? They're going to see implications to that downstream, right? People are going to be less likely to want to help them out on their deals, right? And so if you can promote, like I said, a sort of a long-term view on this, that look, you're going to benefit by being, amicable in how you determine your splits. Maybe you take 5% less on this split, but the next one you work on with that person, you're going to get 5% more. Then that tends to mitigate those types of situations.
Fantastic. Thanks for speaking to that. I'm going to go ahead and grab Anya here. Anya, you are live. It looks like you are currently muted, but
hey.
Fire away. All right. Hi, Anya. Thanks for participating.
No worries. And I hear you on the technical stuff. I got booted out of Zoom, and so now I'm on my phone. So I just had a question around, you talked about decelerants, and I'm thinking specifically around multi-year deals. In this case, where the customer pays it all up front. So it's the company that I'm thinking about has actually put a cap on paying out the commissions to 18 months. And so now all the reps are like, well, why would we bother selling beyond 18 months? Because we're not getting commissioned on that. And so I haven't gotten into the rationale specifically of why leadership has chosen to do this, but I'm curious for your thoughts.
Yeah, so it's a tricky situation. And my suggestion is make sure that when they're figuring out what your quotas are, they're taking into account the fact how many deals are expected to be 18-month deals, 12-month deals, 36-month deals, and therefore the quota aligns to what they're actually compensating on. because reps will care less about the fact they're only getting compensated for an 18-month deal if they're only holding the equivalent quota for the 18 months. Now, the other side of that question, though, is, there's benefit to signing longer term deals, and I mentioned that in the presentation. If that's the case, then sales management or whoever's creating those plans should offer, in many cases, a sliding scale where it does increase the longer the duration of the plan is. You don't want to completely disincent sellers from selling longer deals, because if they're not incented to do that, they're absolutely going to take the smaller overall sales size, because presumably that's easier to close. So the way I typically see it best implemented is have a sliding scale where 3 years may pay, for example, 2 years worth of ACV. But when calculating the quota, make sure that you're determining of all the revenue that comes in, how much is expected to be in 3-year deals, and basically decrease that by a third to reference the fact that you're only now going to hold quota for 2 years worth of ACV on those deals.
Thanks for clarifying that, Carrie. We've got time for one more here. We're going to go ahead and go to Ross. Ross, you're on. You just need to unmute and you should be good to go.
Thank you. So in the examples, it looked like all the comp plans were based on meeting sales targets. My team has pretty significant sales enablement responsibilities as well. How do you recommend doing that split between sort of project-based work and meeting sales quotas?
Yeah, great question. So in most cases, the way I would suggest doing it is having multiple components of the comp plan. So split it up based on, say, 50% of their on-target earnings are attributed to attainment to some sort of sales or revenue goal, and 50% are based on bonuses that are tied to specific goals related to sales enablement. And you're going to vary what that weighting is depending on the amount of time you want them spending on each of those activities, right? But don't weight sales enablement by 75% if you're expecting them to spend 50% of their time actually closing new business. Let's just make sure those are aligned.
All right, fantastic. Thanks for that. It looks like that's just about all the time we have. We're 5 minutes. We went significantly past the top of the hour. I want to thank everybody for attending and participating. I kind of like this format for Q&A. We'll have to look at maybe doing some of this for the next one. So
John,
thanks again, Carrie.
I'm just going to make one comment. If people
Yeah.
would like the slides, I'm very happy to provide them. Just send me an email. You can see it on the screen, just Carrie at Presales Mastery, and happy to share the slide deck with you.
Fantastic. All right, Carrie at Presales Mastery for the slide deck. Thanks again, everybody. And I want to remind everybody that we've got a webinar with Peter Cohen coming up later on this month. Don't forget to register for that, and we'll see everybody at the next webinar. Thanks again, Carrie.
Take care. Thanks, John.
All right, take care all.